On today's deck check, look over there! It's Godzilla. At the time of this recording, this Godzilla deck will be a bracket 3 green-red aggro deck built to ramp quickly and get out powerful creatures onto the battlefield to overrun opponents' board states before they have a chance to retaliate. The commander, Godzilla, King of the Monsters, is a reskin of a previously released card called Zilortha, Strength Incarnate. Godzilla is a dinosaur legendary creature with 3 generic, 1 red, and 1 green mana with trample that says, lethal damage dealt to creatures you control is determined by their power rather than their toughness. At 7 power and 3 toughness, you can see this card's single value in helping it stay alive against other creatures. So when Godzilla reaches the battlefield, all of our creatures can get a type of buff. We're going to flood the deck with many other creatures with power greater than their toughness to try and flip the battlefield in our favor. To do this, we're really going to lean heavily into green ramp staples like Cultivate, Farseek, Nature's Lore, Kadama's Reach, 3 Visits, and a new one from Final Fantasy called Reach the Horizon, that for 3 generic and 1 green mana lets you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and or town cards with different names, putting them into the battlefield tapped. At 4 mana, it's not nearly the early game ramp that we need, but 3 turns in with a Soul Ring, and Cultivate, and suddenly you've got a decent mana pool to start casting big creatures. But that's not the only ramp we'll have in the deck. Ruby, Daring Tracker, Elysian Caryatid, Birds of Paradise, and Fanatic Ronus will all give us some additional mana to tap for their abilities. And we'll throw in green-red staple for Goblin Anarchomancer to reduce the cost of green or red spells by 1, and Goreclaw Terra of Kalsisma to reduce the cost of our bigger creatures. Finally, we're stacking Jolene, Plundering Pugilist into the deck to give us a treasure token every time one of our creatures with power 4 or greater attack. And suddenly, we're looking pretty good with our mana ramp despite the cost of some of the creatures in this deck. As I mentioned earlier, a large portion of the creatures in the deck will have a high power and either equal or slightly lower toughness. This allows us to get those creatures out a little bit earlier because we save on the cost of some of the creatures. For example, Ansrag the Quake Mole is an 8/4 legendary mole god for only 4 mana that when blocked, gives us an additional combat phase. There's also Phytotitan, a 7/2 plant elemental for 6 mana that, when it dies, you return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next upkeep. You have essentially a 7/7 Undying Plant Titan on the board that can only be dealt with if it's exiled. 3 other standouts from this type of creature is Shifting Ceratops, which for 2 generic and 2 green mana can be countered, has protection from blue, and for 1 additional mana can get Reach, Trample, or Haste. There's also Thunderblust, which is a little more expensive at 2 generic and 3 red mana, but comes in as a 7/2 with Haste and Persist, which means that if it goes into the graveyard from the battlefield, it's returned to play with a -1/-1 counter on it. But then it gains Trample as well. So with Godzilla on the board, you've essentially got a 6/6 creature with Haste and Trample for only 5 mana. It's pretty good value. The last creature I want to highlight in terms of big power, little toughness, is Silverclad Ferocidons. They are a little more expensive at 5 generic and 2 red, but they come with the Enrage power, which says whenever they are dealt damage, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. So not only do you get a big swing for damage with this card, you make the entire table pause for a second before they choose to chump block with this creature. While all the creatures I mentioned are heavy hitters in their own right, there are a few in the deck that your opponent should probably take care of either before they reach the battlefield or shortly after it. The first is Galta Primal Hunger, a 12/12 legendary dinosaur that sees a lot of play in big green aggro decks because its casting cost is reduced by the total power of creatures you control. With so many beefy creatures in this deck, it can easily come out earlier in the game than expected and be a menace to your opponents. The second creature is Diamond Weapon. While its casting cost can vary depending on how many permanents you have in the graveyard, having an immunity to combat damage in a heavy combat-focused deck makes it tough to get off the board. Your opponents will have to make some tough choices when they use their counters or removal spells throughout this game. Kedis, Emberclaw Familiar, is a card that's seen a decent amount of play in mono-red decks over the years because it amplifies combat damage from your commander to not only hit the player you're attacking, but all other opponents. Oh, and look, Godzilla just happens to have Trample. Would you look at that? Finally, the last destroy on-site creature is Twin Flame Tyrant. This card is expensive in both terms of casting cost and monetary value because it doubles the damage output of any source you control. And suddenly, Godzilla is now swinging for 14 damage instead of 7. It's important to note though that Twin Flame Tyrant doesn't double the power of Godzilla, just the damage it can do. So your creatures don't suddenly have double the health they did before. Unless you're running Unnatural Growth, which is in this deck for obvious reasons, as well as Domri and Arcabolus, which give creatures a +1/+0 and can be used as a mana source for its +1 Planeswalker ability. For good measure, I also threw in a cheap bulk up instant spell to either deal additional damage or help protect a creature from a board wipe like Blasphemous Act. And speaking of, you can put in your own copy of Blasphemous Act into the deck for a board wipe if you want, but I prefer a new card from the Final Fantasy set called Nibelheim Aflame. It says, choose target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to each other creature. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, discard your hand and draw 4 cards. So instead of a blanket amount of damage to every other creature on the board, you get to be more selective in how you dish out that damage, and you get to keep a creature out on the board. There's also some targeted removal in this deck, like Destructive Revelry to deal with artifacts and enchantments, and Beast Within to destroy another target permanent at the cost of giving its controller a 3/3 green beast token. But there's also Sarkhan's Unsealing, which allows you to ping any target when you cast a creature spell with power 4, 5, or 6 for 4 damage. That's great for taking out smaller chump blockers or even finishing off an opponent with direct damage. And if you cast a creature with power 7 or greater, say your commander, then Sarkhan's Unsealings deals 4 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. And also, don't forget, it counts as a source for Twin Flame Tyrant. To keep the engine running, you'll need a decent amount of card draw, so I've included Up the Beanstalk in this deck with so many creatures having a mana value of 5 or greater. But also in the deck are Shamanic Revelation and Soul's Majesty for a quick infusion of cards and life based on the power of the creatures you have on the battlefield. Finally, to make sure that we keep the party going, we have a plethora of green-red lands like Rugged Highlands and Temple of Abandon that lets you gain life and scry when you play them, as well as Wooded Foothills, which is great sack land to help you get mana fixing early in the game. Toss in a Path of Ancestry, Command Tower, and Exotic Orchard among a decent amount of mountains and forests, and you're good to go. I should note though, this deck leans more heavily into needing green mana, so go harder into forests over mountains. And that's everything for Godzilla, King of the Monsters. If you like the deck list, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you do something different though, let me know down in the comments. I love to know what other people do with these decks. And if you like the videos that I'm making on this channel, hit the subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss when I upload another video. Until next time, I've been Mallow, and you've been awesome.